Continuing on with our conversations about Greek archaic architecture, and today's conversation is going to be about temples, and we're going to be focusing on how temples evolved through the Greek architectural times. So in the last video we talked about the treasuries and how they were constructed and their rich architecture, and this time we're going to be talking about the temples. And you have to understand there's this sort of slow evolution. It took centuries to kind of get to this point. And for hundreds of years, the Greeks worshipped at sanctuaries. And they were basically outdoor altars that stood probably within an enclosed sacred area. And this was sort of this cutaway piece of land, and it was called a temenos. I guess that's how it's pronounced. And this was specifically reserved for worshiping. And then as time went by, sometimes those temples became sheltered. They would shelter because there was a sculpture of a god that were incorporated into these sanctuaries. So you might see, Hera, you might see Apollo in a sculpture. And these sculptures ranged in sizes depending on how much money was in that area at that time. And then often later additions to an established sanctuary would occur, and a number of standardized temple plans began to evolve over time. So one of those evolutions was the creation of columned porches, and for this one what we have is the Erechtheion, and we don't see that traditional columned porch. What we have are our caryatids, but this is another example of a porch, which is a simple one-roomed structure, and it was covered and had an open space in the front of an entrance, as we see here, and it was attached to a building sometimes with the double porches, such as the front and a back. Then as time went by, architects or builders began to experiment with design of a temple elevation, that is, the arrangements and the appearance of columns and lintels and the proportions, began to really analyze how the structure would look from a distance. And what began to emerge in here were columns of different orders. So here are the three Greek orders that you should have an understanding of. And what we have right here in this side, we'll start from left and we're going to go to right, that this is the Doric order right here. And we'll see that the columns were done in sections versus what we have here in the Ionic and the Corinthian order. And so these were cut in pieces and then sort of stacked on top of one another. So this is the Doric, okay, as you have this sort of flaring off at the bottom, and then it attaches itself into the abacus, which is this portion right here. This being the Ionic. Ionic is pretty easy to recognize because of this sort of swirling. We call that the volute right there. And then we have this sort of plant life, this vegetal, and this is the Corinthian order. So for you art history kids, you AP art history kids, you have to remember Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, and they all, served not only just a purpose of holding up the structure, this post and lintel construction, just to remind you that Greeks used a lot of post and lintel construction, and so what you would find is that the columns would be very close to one another, because if you spaced them out too far, well, you have this wonderful thing called gravity, and it cracks the lintel that's right here. And then we would have our frieze art, some continuous art or broken up art above that as well. So Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, and they have a purposeful role in Greek architecture. So let's take a look at some examples of archaic Doric temples. This structure was built around 550 BCE. It still stands at its former Greek colony. The Greeks were prolific colonizers, and the reason that they would colonize other parts of the Mediterranean wasn't so much to spread their culture, It was because a lot of the city-states became overpopulated, and how do you relieve that pressure of overpopulation before people begin to kind of run over the top of each other and conflict begins to arise, is that you put them on ships and you say go out into the Mediterranean and go settle in other parts. And that's what they were doing. So this temple sits in one of those sort of original Greek colonies in Macedonia. And this is about 50 miles south of our modern state of Naples. Now, this temple is obviously is dedicated to Hera. She was the tutelary goddess of this colony. She is the wife of Zeus. And today we refer to this temple as Hera the First, which obviously tells us that there was maybe another temple. We see these road columns called the peristyle that surround the main room. The main room would have been known as the cella. And the columns of this particular temple are robust if you look at them. And what they do is that at the bottom they're fairly round, but as you look at the image, you'll see that they kind of get a little fatter in the middle and then kind of taper back up to the top. And then it kind of gets into the abacus, as you see on the top. And this creates this impression of stability and permanence. But yet there's also, as you look from the corner that we're at the right side corner, that there's a sense of harmony as we look at this elevation. So what we should know about, again, the column shafts rise, they swell in the middle, and contract to get smaller again towards the top. And this refinement, this skill is known as the entasis, E-N-T-A-S-I-S. And it gives also a sense of lift. It gives almost an energy to the column. Hera first has an uneven number of columns. This should be in your notes. 9 across the short end of the peristyle, with a column instead of a space at the center of the two ends. Now, the entrance of this temple, the praenos, is a closed vestibule, had 3 columns in its antis. And a row of columns runs down the center of the wide cella to help support the ceiling and roof, because again, this is post and lintel construction. Another example of a Doric temple, which was created between 500 or 475 BCE. This is the temple of Apphia, and what we see, the first thing you should notice are the columns. They seem a bit sleeker, much thinner. Part of a temple dedicated to the local goddess named Apphia, and it's built on an island of Aegean, I guess. And what we have is this temple is overlooking the sea. The temple is fairly well preserved in spite of the loss of its pediment and its roof and sections of its colonnade, but evidence is still there to form a reliable reconstruction of the original appearance. And in the middle of this particular slide, we see that sort of reconstruction. And this temple, like most Greek temples, the building was neither isolated nor situated in an open space. By enclosing the temple within a walled precinct or a temenos, the architect could control the viewer's initial experience of the temple. You would enter the sacred space through a gatehouse. The temple would be seen at an oblique angle. And unlike, say, like the Egyptian temples of the time that were long processionals approach that led visitors directly to the entrance of the facade, the Greeks architects revealed from the outset the full shape of a closed, compact sculptural mass, the temple. And this was inviting viewers not to enter seeking something within, but rather to walk around and sort of take it in, to go explore the sculptural elements, the embellishments on the outside. And cult ceremonies often took place outside the temple, so you can either be inside or you can be outside as well. In the pediment, which was lost in the original structure in our earlier slide, that we have this sort of storyline being told in what we have on both sides, the right and the left. And when this would have been found in the pediment is our dying warriors. And what we're seeing here in the archaic, we have these two warriors, archaic smile, the plaited hair. You kind of get that idea. And it's sort of like the archaic smile works against the theme. And what we have here is that we have noble figures, warriors who are struggling to get up, to rise up, because they've been shot. One has pulling an arrow out of his chest, another has an arrow in the side of his body, and they're on the ground and they're trying to push themselves up with their bent leg or their elbows and extract that arrow. And we know that death is certain with these figures. Now, the other thing we need to understand about our Greek artists, first of all, these sculptures are most likely done off-site or near the building site, but also that these pieces of sculpture in the pediment, the whole pediment would have been painted, and they would have had bright colors to really, pop out as the people walked around the temple and would have seen this. These two structures do come from, I believe, the east side of this temple pediment sculpture. So for this video podcast, what do we need to walk away with is that you need to understand that architecture for the Greeks evolved. And this kind of plays into the idea that Greek artists were such a restless group of people. They were always looking to, do something new. We also see that during the Archaic time, new column orders were being born. The Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. You should know these things. And, just as one little thing that I tell my students is that, if you're looking at Greek and Roman, Greeks built post and lintel, and Romans did too, but Greeks built with marble and Romans used concrete. And last thing is that temples were not only just designed for the pantheon of gods and goddesses in the Greek religion, meaning that this temple, this sacred site, was built for religious reasons, but as we get into our temples, there's also this idea, this subtle idea of Greek government. These structures were all about telling the people subliminally that the Greek government was stable, it was permanent, it was harmonious, or it was in harmony with the people. Well, that's it. Thanks for listening.